Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We are wrapping up the show here. It's been all Super Bowl talk today. We talked the game itself. We talked some Chiefs. Now we're going to be talking a little bit about the losing side here in the 49ers, who, suffer the hands of another very successful season and yet can't get it done once again. It's obviously led by their head coach, Kyle Shanahan, who has a little bit of doubt that is just following him around at this point. A quick recap, because we've been over it plenty of times. He was with the Falcons when they blew the 28-3 game against the Patriots in the Super Bowl in 2016. He was a part of the 49ers team that blew the 20-10 lead in the fourth quarter against the Chiefs the last time these two teams met up in 2019, I believe it was, and allowed 21 straight points to get shut out down the stretch in that game and lose that. I think that Shanahan as a whole, we obviously know him for his offensive mind and the system that he's able to put into place. And while that is great, we see some lapses with him with being able to come up in these big moments. And I think sort of the bigger issue at hand is some of the decision-making things for him. The big one that came out of this game was the decision to receive the ball in overtime. And it becomes an even bigger story because as of this morning, we got a few stories from a few different outlets talking about how there were 49ers players that were unaware of the rule change in overtime, whereas the Chiefs players were made extremely aware of it, and they reviewed it frequently. So when this was happening in real time, I thought that the initial decision for them to receive it was maybe to, I wouldn't say protect, but to just get Purdy in his zone, get him to do his thing, not worry about any external factors about what number of points you need to score to keep the game alive or to win. I thought it was sort of trying to simplify that, and I didn't think it was a terrible decision at the time, but as this went on, you could sort of see as it was playing out that they were in for a little bit of trouble. Now, it almost went completely sideways for them when Purdy almost threw an interception on the first play of the game. Bolton just wasn't able to get both of his hands under it, but he makes a little bit of a risky throw over the middle. Bolton has a good play, but just can't quite hang on to it. And then after a false start penalty, they were put in a 3rd and long situation and sort of got bailed out from a defensive holding call against the Chiefs. It was definitely the right call, but automatic first down there, and that sort of helped get them going. But even then, they drive down the field, but we just saw this offense with a little bit of a lack of ability to finish these drives for a lot of the game. We saw in the fourth quarter when they went for it on 4th and 3. They go out to Kittle, who gets the first down yardage that ultimately sets up the Juwan Jennings touchdown. So that was a huge play, but all in all, I really didn't think that they were all that effective. I mean, they had to settle for multiple 50-yard field goal attempts, relying on, again, Jake Moody, who I don't think was really the villain for 49ers fans because of that missed kick. I think that he did just about everything they asked of him and a little bit more. Yes, the PAT ends up getting blocked, but again, you were leaving it in sort of field goal range-ish when you aren't able to finish off these drives, and you have to end up settling for field goals. So, it's kind of tough here. It's not like the offense was bad, and I thought Brock Purdy as a whole was solid. Again, he had that Bolton play where he was almost intercepted, and he had another throw earlier in the game that I thought could have been picked off as well. But, I think that all in all, it was just a little bit of a disappointing offensive performance, and obviously, the level of talent that is on that Chiefs defensive side of the ball. So, you know, the Chiefs defense, I believe, they finished allowing less than 16 points per game in this playoff run. So, obviously, really impressive stuff there. The Chiefs, or the 49ers, that is, put up, the Bills might have had more than them, but a, very respectable performance, but obviously not enough. And I think that it's really interesting just the way that if you look at the decision to receive the ball, Shanahan after the game talked about he wanted to have the ball third if both teams scored with a chance to win it in a sudden death situation. But I feel like that's planning ahead a little bit too much. Maybe just focus on one drive at a time. That doesn't really make sense to me. And it is also interesting just to note that Shanahan is the only person in NFL history to be involved in both the Falcons-Patriots overtime Super Bowl and this one, the only two overtime Super Bowl games in the history of the NFL. And he played in that other one before the rules were different. And it's interesting how multiple guys on the 49ers talked about how they weren't aware of the changes to the rules. And no, it didn't really have an effect because one way or another, even if it were the old rules, the Niners kicked a field goal, the Chiefs would have been given another possession, and they would have had a chance to win it on a walk-off touchdown like they did. But I don't know. I mean, Kyle Juszczyk and Eric Armstead both talked about it after the game. Makes you think that maybe if the players were more aware of it, there could have been more heads involved in the understanding of what this moment means, and maybe they have somebody in that locker room that can sort of speak up and say, hey, are we sure about this? And just sort of talk it out more. Meanwhile, the Chiefs side of this, they were talking about it all year, supposedly. Drew Tranquill and Justin Reed and Chris Jones all talked about how it was a regular conversation for them throughout the playoffs, and it was even stated during training camp that this was a rule. They should be prepared for it. And really, I think that word prepared is kind of the big thing in all of this, because Shanahan just sort of had a lapse in helping his team to be prepared and to understand what you're preparing for, this big game, your entire season on the line. Just a little bit of a lack of doing your job if you're Shanahan. You want to have your guys know the moment, know what you need to do, and he failed to do that. And yes, this was the first instance of the rules coming into play in the playoffs in overtime, but it's been a rule for a couple years. There was a ton of conversation about it when the rule was changing, dating back to the 2018 AFC Championship game, where people were mad that this was not a rule, and then the 13 seconds game between the Chiefs and the Bills, where everybody thought it was unfair again when the Bills didn't get a chance to touch the ball in overtime. So, this was a conversation. This has been a conversation across the league for years, and Kyle Shanahan, despite being in an overtime Super Bowl game, a handful of years before, didn't really have the thought to, clue his team in on it. I don't know if maybe it was something he just thought to take for granted that everybody would know. And again, this conversation is slightly blown out of proportion because ultimately it wouldn't have really had an effect the way that the game had played out based off of them kicking a field goal. The Chiefs end up scoring the touchdown, but it's malpractice, I feel like, for Shanahan to not key his guys in, because I feel like somebody in that locker room would have understood the importance. I mean, they all played college football, and that's like a big rule in college football is you want to know what you have to score because you can control the game a little bit more. Where, Chris Jones talked about it after the game as well, that the Chiefs were prepared to go for two if they had the 49ers scored on their first overtime drive, but they didn't. And again, that's just like, it's one of those things where it would have been fascinating if we got to that moment, but it's an advantage you do have to know how many points. You essentially have a fourth down when you need to, and you can just call your plays differently too down the stretch. And I don't necessarily disagree with Shanahan like other people do about the decision to kick the field goal. I mean, it's tough. It really is tough because on one hand, it's doable. You're inside the Chiefs' 10-yard line, so you do have them backed up, but it also, they had already converted on a 4th and 3 earlier in the game on that fourth quarter touchdown drive. This one's slightly longer, and I don't know. After the game Harrison Butker was hitting the 57-yarder, I feel like it's really tough to go out on a made field goal like that where essentially half of the field is his field goal range, and you want to have a little bit more faith in your defense that you can keep them out of the end zone versus getting pushed back, 30, 40 yards. But a lot of controversy around Shanahan, and I think that that's just inherently also about sort of who Shanahan is at this point, the very successful coach, but there's a pattern forming here about the lack of coming up in the biggest possible moments. I didn't even think his play calling was bad necessarily. A lot of people were upset that they didn't run the ball more, but there was that stretch early in the second half where they went 3 and out on their first 2 possessions, running 6 plays and 6 passes. But McCaffrey did finish with 22 yards. He had 30 total touches, and on the ground it was only 3.6 yards per carry. Not a bad mark, but it wasn't like they were running down the throats of the Chiefs here. And I think that it really just comes down to them not capitalizing on these drives, and you can call it play calling, you could call it the offensive line. I mean, there was pressure on Purdy a lot, and he made some throws in pressure, but I also don't think that, he wasn't really running as much as we saw in the second half against Detroit that really added this extra element to their offense. And I think that it's just whoever you had the negative feeling about, you can blame. I don't think there's any sole responsibility. The players just didn't necessarily come up just enough, but Shanahan could have done things differently as well, which is a little bit of a cop-out thing of me to say. But, I think that all in all, this game was more so just about the Chiefs being better. And it was a great game. This was a classic Super Bowl for us. We get another overtime Super Bowl, and we have the theatrics of the comeback and, going back and forth a little bit down the stretch. It was a lot of fun. And sort of to what I talked about in the first segment, I don't think that it was anybody really choking, but there were obviously things that both teams could have done better, and we are choosing to look at them more because it's the 49ers and because they lost. I think that a very interesting sort of thing that happened, but won't get any talk whatsoever because the Chiefs won, is on the Chiefs' field goal drive to send the game to overtime right at the end of regulation. Mahomes had a pretty bad sequence, honestly, where he tries to scramble up, he gains a few yards, but he is tackled. He then brings everybody back to the line. Pacheco's 15, 20 yards down the field, so he has to run back, get set, and they choose not to spike it. They run an actual play, but nothing's there, so he hangs in there for a few seconds and then just throws it away. That ends up chewing about 15-ish seconds off of the clock, and had circumstances been different, then they get the Kelsey play that takes them all the way upfield inside the 10-yard line. They get minimum one more shot at the end zone had they had those extra 15 seconds. I mean, I don't know if they actually even ended up using their timeout late in the game like that. They had one at the time. I know they were holding on to it, and I don't know if they used it to even stop the clock. I think it was more so, if they did even use it, it was just to strategize. But again, you sort of cost yourself a big time shot at ending the game right there. And again, we always look at the results of how things played out versus how they could have played out, which is the right thing to do, of course. But it's just interesting. Kyle Shanahan is going to get the scrutiny because he's in the losing position in this one. So, I mean, I think it's a little bit of a bummer for his sake. I think he's a great coach, and I think that he catches a lot of negativity because of being in the position with a premier franchise and not being able to get the job done just yet. The 49ers championship drought extends another year. They haven't won since 1995. And, the pressure is going to be surrounding him going forward. It's curious. They are actually currently, according to PFF, in the red in terms of projected salary cap. But, they're going to have decisions to make. They're still going to have a very talented team. But it's going to be interesting how they move forward from here, and specifically Kyle Shanahan. You'd like to think that you don't make that mistake twice as far as the overtime rule in the playoffs, and specifically, again, the lack of having your team prepared. But, only time will tell, really. So that is all we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Just remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you listen to us / watch us, and we will be back tomorrow at 2 o'clock. So I'm TJ Mabarty, and thanks for tuning in.